The dust rose like a curse from the desert floor, billowing in columns that touched the sky. Through the shimmering heat they came, a tide of bronze and leather, wood and fury. Thousands upon thousands of Hittite war chariots cresting the hills like a living nightmare, their wheels churning the earth into chaos. The sound reached Ramses II before the full sight did. A thunder that wasn't thunder, a rumble that came not from the heavens, but from the ground itself, growing louder with every heartbeat until it seemed the world itself was splitting open. He stood alone on his golden chariot, his 2 horses, Victory and Thebes, and Mut is satisfied, stomping nervously at the scent of blood that already hung in the air. Behind him should have been 4 divisions of Egypt's finest soldiers, 20,000 men, the pride of the Nile. Instead, there was almost nothing. The division of Amun, his personal guard, lay scattered and broken across 3 miles of Syrian wasteland. The other divisions, Ra, Ta, and Seth, were too far south to reach him in time, strung out along the road to Kadesh like beads on a broken string. He had been lured here, fed false intelligence by Hittite spies posing as deserters, and he had believed them. The great Pharaoh, beloved of the gods, had walked into a trap that would have shamed a novice commander. Now Muwatalli II, king of the Hittites, had him exactly where he wanted him. The irony cut deeper than any blade. Ramses had spent the first 5 years of his reign building his legend. At 24, he had already commissioned more temples than his father, expanded Egypt's borders, and proclaimed himself the living embodiment of Horus on earth. His face was carved into mountains. His name was written in cartouches from Nubia to the shores of the Great Green Sea. Poets sang of his strength, his wisdom, his divine beauty. And now, at 29, he would die in the dirt like any common soldier. His body left for the vultures and his name cursed for generations as the Pharaoh who lost Egypt's northern territories through arrogance and stupidity. Unless Ramses tightened his grip on the reins, the leather bit into his palms, grounding him. Around him, the few dozen men still standing looked to their king with eyes that had already accepted death. Some prayed, some wept. Others simply stared at the approaching horde with the blank expression of those who had seen their own ending and found it wanting. "My lord," the voice came from his left, Menah, his chariot driver, a grizzled veteran who had served Ramses since the young prince was barely old enough to hold a sword. "My lord, we must retreat. If we ride now, we might—" Might what? Ramses didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the enemy forces, now close enough that he could make out individual chariots, individual warriors. Outrun 3,000 chariots? Abandon what remains of the division of Amun to be slaughtered while their king flees to safety. "My lord, you are Egypt. If you die here, the kingdom— If I run, there will be no kingdom worth ruling." Ramses finally turned to face Menah, and something in his expression made the older man fall silent. "Do you know what they'll say? Not just the Hittites, but our own people. They'll say that the great Ramses, who compared himself to the gods, who covered every temple wall with scenes of his own glory, ran like a frightened dog when faced with real danger. They'll say I was a coward who sent men to die while I preserved my own precious skin." "You're being foolish," Menah said quietly. "This is pride talking, not wisdom." "Perhaps. But I have been foolish since the day we crossed into Hittite territory. I was foolish to believe those deserters, foolish to separate my divisions, foolish to think Muwatalli would meet me in open battle like an honorable king. Why stop being foolish now? He raised his voice so the remaining soldiers could hear him. Men of Egypt, the enemy comes. They outnumber us 50-1. Every strategic advantage belongs to them. Any commander would tell you we are already dead. The brutal honesty seemed to shock his soldiers more than the approaching army. They had expected encouragement, not confirmation of their worst fears. But I tell you this, and now his voice took on the ringing quality that had commanded armies and silenced council chambers. I am Ramses, beloved of Amun, chosen of Ra, the living Horus. I have proclaimed myself a god among men, and if I am to die this day, let the whole world see that gods do not run, gods do not hide, gods stand and fight, even when the outcome is written in the stars. He drew his kopesh, the curved bronze blade catching the afternoon sun. He charged you now with a final command. Do not fight to live. Fight to show these northern dogs what it means to face Egypt. Fight so that the survivors flee back to Muatali. They will tremble at the memory of this day. And fight so that the gods themselves will look down and say, these were men worthy of the two lands. The effect was instantaneous. Something shifted in the eyes of his soldiers, a transformation from resignation to something wilder, more primal. If death was certain, at least let it be a death worth remembering. Mana looked at his king for a long moment, then shook his head with something that might have been admiration or madness. Very well, my lord. Where a god leads, a man may follow. But for what it's worth, you always were the worst student I ever tried to teach caution. Your lessons never took, Ramses agreed. He raised his blade toward the approaching storm. Amun-Ra, he shouted, the battle cry tearing from his throat. For Egypt and for glory. The few dozen remaining chariots formed up behind him, a pitiful force against the thousands bearing down on them. But they formed up nonetheless, and when his king's chariot lurched forward into that impossible charge, they followed. The Hittite commanders, watching from their vantage point, could not believe what they were seeing. The Egyptian king, surrounded and outnumbered beyond all hope, was attacking. It violated every principle of warfare, every instinct of survival. It was the action of either a madman or someone who had transcended fear entirely. Ramses rode at the center of the charge, and as the distance closed between the two forces, he felt something he had not expected to feel in what he assumed were his final moments. Clarity. His whole life had been a performance, a carefully constructed image of divine kingship. Every public appearance, every decree, every temple relief showing him smiting enemies had been about reinforcing the myth of Ramses the Great, Ramses the Invincible, Ramses beloved of the gods. But myths did not bleed. Myths did not feel the burn of dust in their throats or the hammering of their hearts against their ribs. Myths did not know the specific weight of failure settling on their shoulders like a lead cloak. He was not a myth. He was a man who had made terrible mistakes. But perhaps in these final moments, he could at least be an honest man. The first impact came like a collision with a wall. The Hittite chariots hit the Egyptian line with devastating force, and suddenly Ramses was in the heart of it. Bronze clashing, men screaming, horses shrieking in terror and pain. An axe whistled past his head close enough to stir his hair. He swung his blade in a wide arc, felt it connect with flesh, felt the shock of impact travel up his arm. Time became strange. Seconds stretched into eternities. He saw details with unnatural clarity, the gap in a Hittite soldier's teeth as the man screamed war cry, the way dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, the intricate pattern of bronze scales on an enemy chariot warrior's armor. Mana drove a chariot with impossible skill, weaving between enemy vehicles, keeping them moving so they wouldn't be surrounded and dragged down. An arrow struck Ramses's shoulder guard, the bronze deflecting it, but the force of impact leaving a numbing sensation down his entire arm. Another grazed his thigh, drawing blood. He barely felt it. There was no room for pain, no space for anything except the immediate, visceral reality of survival. And then, impossibly, they broke through the first wave. Mena let out a whoop of disbelief. "My lord, we're through!" But Ramses knew better. They hadn't won. They had simply survived the first few seconds. Behind them, the few dozen Egyptian chariots that had followed him into that charge were gone, scattered, destroyed, or lost in the chaos. Ahead, more Hittite forces wheeled to cut off any escape. "Keep driving," Ramses commanded, "toward the river. There are hundreds more between us, and I said drive." What happened next would be debated by military historians for thousands of years, picked apart by generals and strategists trying to understand how the impossible became reality. Some would attribute it to divine intervention, others to blind luck. A few, perhaps, would recognize it for what it was, the unpredictable power of audacity. Because as Ramses's chariot continued its mad charge, something unexpected occurred. The Hittite lines, so confident in their numerical superiority, began to waver. It started small, individual chariots swerving to avoid direct collision with the Pharaoh's golden vehicle. But uncertainty spread like fire. If the Egyptian king was this confident, the Hittite warriors began to wonder. What did he know that they didn't? Was this a feint? Was the rest of the Egyptian army about to appear from behind the hills? Fear, once planted, grew quickly. Ramses sensed the shift. Without fully understanding it, he leaned into it, driving harder, shouting louder, making himself as visible and terrifying as possible. He was no longer fighting to kill enemies, but to create an impression, to become in this moment what his propaganda had always claimed he was, an unstoppable force, a god incarnate, a being beyond mortal limitation. An enemy chariot came at him from the right. He turned his blade, caught the driver across the face with it, sent the man tumbling backward. The chariot veered away, collided with another Hittite vehicle. Both went down in a tangle of wood and horses and men. Another enemy archer drew back his bowstring. Ramses locked eyes with him across the distance, and perhaps it was imagination, but he thought he saw the man hesitate just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Mena turned the chariot sharply, and the arrow meant for Ramses's heart whispered past his ear. "By all the gods," Mena muttered, his arms straining to control the horses. "By all the gods of Egypt and the heavens above, I think we might actually—" The chariot wheel hit a rock. For one sickening moment they were airborne, the golden vehicle tilting dangerously. Ramses grabbed the rail with his free hand, keeping his balance through sheer will. They came down hard, the impact jarring his teeth, but the wheel held. And then, emerging from the dust like an answer to a prayer he hadn't dared to speak, Ramses saw them. Egyptian chariots. Not dozens, but hundreds. The division of Ptah finally arriving from the south, their approach hidden by the terrain until this moment. The Hittite commander saw them too, and in that instant, what had been confidence became confusion, became panic. The trap had become a trap for the trappers. But Ramses barely noticed. His entire being was focused on one thing, continuing to move forward, continuing to fight, continuing to be the image of kingship he had promised his men he would be. His arm ached from wielding the blade. Blood, his own and others, slicked his hands. His throat was raw from shouting. Every muscle screamed for rest. He ignored it all. For what might have been hours or might have been minutes, the battle raged. The arrival of the division of Ptah transformed the engagement from a massacre into a contest. The Hittites, caught between the fresh Egyptian forces and the still fighting remnants of the division of Amun, found themselves in the same nightmare they had intended for their enemy. Ramses fought on. He had lost count of how many opponents he had faced, how many times death had brushed past him with inches to spare. His bronze blade was notched and dulled. His chariot bore the scars of a dozen impacts. Menna had taken an arrow in the shoulder, but continued driving with grim determination, his face a mask of pain and concentration. The sun was low on the horizon when the Hittite forces finally broke. Not defeated, there were too many of them for that, but no longer unified, no longer coordinated. What had been an organized assault became a confused retreat, as various commanders made independent decisions to withdraw, regroup, reassess. Muwatalli II, watching from his command position, would later claim the battle as a strategic victory. After all, he had forced the Egyptians to retreat from Kadesh, had prevented them from capturing the city. His scribes would write it up as a triumph. But the men who had been there, who had seen the Egyptian pharaoh charge into impossible odds and emerge alive, would tell a different story. They would speak in hushed tones about the king who fought like a demon, who seemed untouchable, who turned certain defeat into survival through sheer force of will. As the immediate danger passed and the Egyptian forces consolidated their position, Ramses finally allowed himself to stop. To actually stop and feel the weight of what had just occurred. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion so profound it seemed to reach into his bones. He dismounted from his chariot, and his legs nearly buckled. Only pride kept him standing. Around him his soldiers were gathering, the survivors of the division of Amun, those who had stood with him in that first impossible charge. The men of the division of Ptah, who had arrived in time to prevent total annihilation. They looked at their king, and something in their eyes had changed. Before today, they followed Ramses because he was pharaoh, because tradition and order demanded it, because the alternative was chaos. Now they followed him because they had seen him ride to death without hesitation, had watched him fight not in the protected rear but at the very front, had witnessed him risk everything rather than abandon his men. Menna approached, his shoulder hastily bandaged, his face drawn with pain. "My lord," he said quietly, "you should have run." "I know. You should have fled south, preserved yourself, lived to fight another day." "I know. You could have been killed 100 times over." "I know." Ramses met his driver's eyes. And yet, Menna agreed, and despite everything, the pain, the losses, the horror of the day, he smiled. "You absolute fool. You impossible, magnificent fool." Ramses looked out over the battlefield. In the fading light, he could see the cost of his decisions. Bodies, Egyptian and Hittite alike, scattered across the desert. Broken chariots. Wounded men calling for water, for help, for their mothers. This was not the clean, glorious victory depicted in temple reliefs. This was the messy, brutal reality of war. He had survived, against all probability,
Against every reasonable expectation, he had survived. But survival came with a price he was only beginning to understand.
That night, as the Egyptian camp settled into an uneasy rest, Ramses found himself unable to sleep. His body ached in places he hadn't known existed. Every breath brought fresh reminders of impacts taken, muscles strained beyond their limits. But it was his mind that refused to settle, replaying the day's events in an endless, torturous loop. He walked through the camp, past soldiers who slept the exhausted sleep of men who had survived the unsurvivable, past the cook fires that had burned down to embers, their warmth a small comfort against the desert night's chill. At the edge of the camp, he found someone else who couldn't sleep. She sat on a flat rock, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, her profile sharp and unmistakable. Nefertari, his great royal wife, who had insisted on accompanying the campaign despite his protests. She was 26 years old, beautiful in the way that Egyptian poets spent entire scrolls trying to capture, but there was something in her bearing that went beyond mere physical beauty, an intelligence, a presence, that had made her his closest advisor as much as his spouse. "You should be resting," as he approached. She didn't turn. "As should you, and yet here we both are." He sat beside her, grateful for the company, for the presence of someone who knew him not as a pharaoh or a god-king, but as a man. They had been married for 7 years, and in that time she had become the one person in his life who could see through his carefully constructed facades. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "The whole camp is talking about it. How you charged into thousands of enemy chariots. How you refused to retreat." "It was madness," Ramses said flatly. "Tactical insanity. If the division of Ptah hadn't arrived and they did, we all would be dead. But they did arrive, and you're alive. Through luck, not skill, not divine favor, just blind, stupid luck." Nefertari finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the starlight. "Do you believe that it was only luck? What else could it have been?" He gestured toward the camp. "I led these men into a trap because I was too arrogant to question obvious lies. I scattered our forces because I was too eager for quick victory. I put us in a position where only a miracle could save us. That's not leadership. That's incompetence dressed up in royal regalia." "And yet," Nefertari said, "those men who survived the charge, who followed you into that impossible situation, they're not cursing your name. They're celebrating it. Do you know what I heard them saying? That they would follow you into the afterlife itself if you asked. That you showed them what it means to have a king worthy of the name. They don't understand. They think they understand perfectly." Her voice was firm now, cutting through his self-recrimination. "They understand that when every calculation said you should abandon them, you didn't. When every instinct screamed at you to preserve yourself, you chose them instead. That's what they're celebrating. Not divine intervention, not supernatural prowess. The simple fact that their king stood with them when it would have been easier to run." Ramses was quiet for a long moment. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of a jackal calling to its mate, a lonely sound that seemed to embody the vast emptiness of the desert around them. "I was so afraid," he admitted finally, the words coming with difficulty. "More afraid than I've ever been in my life. When I saw those chariots coming, when I realized the trap we'd walked into, I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and flee. But you didn't. No, but not because I'm brave, because I realized that running would destroy something worse than my body. It would destroy the idea of what I'm supposed to be. And if that idea dies, what am I? Just another man with a fancy crown." Nefertari reached out and took his hand.
Her fingers were cool against his palm, grounding him in the moment. "You're wrong about something. You think the men follow the idea of you, the propaganda, the divine myth, but that's not what I saw today. They don't follow the idea. They follow you. The man who makes mistakes but owns them. The man who feels fear but acts anyway. That's far more powerful than any myth." "Is it?" Ramses looked down at their joined hands. "I'm not sure I know how to be that man. I've spent so long building the image, constructing the facade, that I don't know what's real anymore." "Then, perhaps," Nefertari said gently, "it's time to find out." They sat together in silence, watching the stars wheel slowly across the desert sky, and in that silence something in Ramses began to shift. The crushing weight of the day's events didn't disappear. It would never truly disappear, but it transformed into something he could carry. A burden, yes, but one that felt almost purposeful. He had led his men into disaster. That was true, and no amount of propaganda could change it. But he had also led them out again. Not because he was a god, not because he was perfect, but because when the moment demanded it, he had found the courage to be the man they needed him to be. That, perhaps, was enough. "Come," Nefertari said, rising and pulling him gently to his feet. "The sun will rise soon, and there will be wounded to tend to, decisions to make, letters to write to the families of the fallen. You'll need whatever rest you can get." "Will you help me?" he asked. "With the letters, I should be the one to tell them, to explain why their sons, their fathers, their brothers died in the Syrian desert." "Of course," she squeezed his hand. "We'll write them together, every single one." As they walked back toward the royal tent, Ramses felt the weight of those future letters settling on his shoulders, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Each one a conversation he didn't want to have, an accounting he couldn't escape. But he would write them. He would face that responsibility as he had faced the Hittite chariots, not because it was easy, not because he wanted to, but because it was what a king should do, what a man should do.
3 days later, as Ramses stood in his command tent studying maps by lamplight, a messenger arrived with news that made his blood run cold. "My lord," the young scout said, breathless from his ride, "the division of Set has engaged a Hittite raiding party 30 miles south. They're requesting reinforcements." Ramses looked up sharply. "How many Hittites?" "Unknown, my lord, but the commander believes it's a significant force." Around the tent, his generals exchanged worried glances. They were still recovering from the battle 3 days ago. Many of the men were wounded, exhausted, operating on the edge of their capabilities. Another engagement so soon could be disastrous. "It could be a trap," one general warned. "Like before, Muwatalli drawing us out, splitting our forces again. Or it could be a genuine raiding party. If we don't respond, the division of Seth could be overrun." Ramses felt the familiar surge of panic trying to claw its way up his throat. Another decision, another chance to make the wrong choice, to lead his men into disaster. The memories of 3 days ago were still raw, still vivid. The sound of those chariots bearing down on him, the taste of his own fear. But now, standing in his tent surrounded by his advisors, he understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. Being a king wasn't about making perfect decisions. It was about making the best decision you could with the information available, then living with the consequences. "Prepare 2 companies of light chariots," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty churning in his gut. "Fast, mobile forces. They'll move south to support the division of Zeth, but maintain the ability to retreat quickly if needed. The main army stays here, fortified. We don't take the bait again." "And who will command the relief force?" a general asked. Ramses hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to go himself, to lead from the front as he had 3 days ago. But that was ego talking, not strategy. He was more valuable here, coordinating the larger force, making sure they didn't end up scattered and vulnerable again. "General Seti," he said,
naming one of his most experienced commanders. He knows the terrain, and he's not prone to rash decisions. There was almost a palpable sense of relief in the tent. His generals had been worried he would insist on leading the charge himself, that the madness of 3 days ago had become his new standard operating procedure. But Ramses was learning, slowly, painfully, but learning nonetheless. The relief force departed within an hour. Ramses watched them grow, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in his chest. What if he'd made the wrong call? What if this was exactly what Muwatalli wanted? What if he was sending men to their deaths through yet another miscalculation? Nefertari appeared at his side, as if sensing his internal struggle. "You can't command from a place of fear," she said quietly, her voice meant only for him. "Not fear of making mistakes, not fear of what people will think. You have to trust your judgment even when it's uncertain." "My judgment nearly destroyed us 3 days ago." "Your judgment also saved you 3 days ago. The decision to charge rather than scatter and be hunted down one by one, that was a calculated risk, whether you want to admit it or not. A gamble, yes, but not a thoughtless one." Ramses considered this. In the chaos of the moment, he had thought of his charge as pure emotion, pure desperation. But perhaps there had been calculation buried in it, the understanding that a coordinated charge, however suicidal it seemed, gave them better odds than a panic retreat where the Hittites could pick them off at their leisure. "I'm not sure I'll ever feel certain again, about any decision." "Good," Nefertari said, and there was no mockery in her voice, only understanding. Certainty is dangerous in a king. It leads to the kind of arrogance that walks into traps. Doubt, used properly, is wisdom. The waiting was torture. Ramses threw himself into the mundane work of command, overseeing the fortification of the camp, checking on the wounded, meeting with supply officers to ensure they had enough food and water for a prolonged stay. But his mind kept drifting south, imagining scenarios both hopeful and catastrophic. It was late afternoon when the scouts returned. "My lord," they called as they rode into camp. "General Seti reports success. The Hittite raiding party has been repelled with minimal losses. It was not a trap, just an opportunistic attack on what they thought was a vulnerable division." The relief that flooded through Ramses was almost physical. He had made the right call, not through divine inspiration, not through supernatural wisdom, but through careful analysis and measured response. It was a small thing, perhaps, a minor tactical success in what was shaping up to be a much larger strategic failure, but it mattered, because it showed him that he could learn, could adapt, could become something better than the rash young king who had ridden north so confident in his own invincibility. That night, he gathered his senior commanders for a council of war. The mood was more somber than it had been at the campaign's outset. They had learned hard lessons, paid prices in blood and pride, but there was also a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "Gentlemen," Ramses began, standing at the head of the table where maps and reports lay scattered, "let us speak plainly about our situation. We came to capture Kadesh and assert Egyptian dominance in the region. We have failed to capture Kadesh. The Hittites hold the city and the surrounding territory. By any objective measure, this campaign has not achieved its primary goal." The bluntness startled his commanders. Pharaohs typically didn't acknowledge failure, even when it was obvious to everyone. "However," Ramses continued, "we have achieved something perhaps more valuable than capturing a city. We have shown the Hittites that Egypt will not be easily intimidated, that our forces can survive their best efforts to destroy us, that our king will stand with his men even in the darkest moment." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I propose we negotiate from this position, not as defeated supplicants begging for mercy, but as equals who have proven their mettle. We establish a treaty, clear borders, mutual respect. We turn this near disaster into a foundation for lasting peace." One of his older generals, a veteran of his father's campaigns, spoke up. "My lord, such a treaty would be seen as a compromise. Your father would never—" "My father," Ramses interrupted gently, "was a great king, but he is not here. I am, and I will not sacrifice more Egyptian lives on the altar of my pride. We will negotiate,
We will establish peace, and we will return to Egypt not as conquerors, but as survivors who learned wisdom through hardship." The tent was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, heads began to nod. Because what Ramses proposed made sense. More than that, it was honest. It acknowledged reality rather than trying to reshape it through propaganda and bluster. "Very well," the veteran general said. "But the people will expect some kind of victory to celebrate, some way to frame this campaign as a success." Ramses smiled, and there was something new in that smile, a maturity that hadn't been there a week ago. "Then we shall give them truth instead of fiction. We shall tell them of the battle where their king stood with his men, where Egyptian soldiers showed courage beyond measure, where we faced annihilation and emerged unbroken. That is a victory worth celebrating, even if it's not the one we originally sought." As the meeting continued, working through the practical details of negotiation and eventual withdrawal, Ramses found himself thinking about legacy. For years he had obsessed over how history would remember him, what monuments would bear his name, what inscriptions would celebrate his deeds, what stories would be told of his reign. Now he understood that legacy wasn't something you could control through propaganda and carefully curated image. It was something that emerged organically from who you actually were, what you actually did when tested. And the legacy he wanted, needed to create, wasn't one of a god king who never made mistakes. It was one of a human king who made enormous mistakes, but faced them with courage and integrity. That, what we thought, was the kind of legacy that might actually last.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The negotiations with the Hittites took weeks. Muwatalli II, recognizing that while he had prevented the capture of Kadesh, he had not broken the Egyptian army, agreed to meet. The talks were tense, filled with posturing and veiled threats, but gradually a framework emerged. Egypt would withdraw from Kadesh, but the Hittites would acknowledge Egyptian dominance in certain southern territories. Trade routes would be established, clear borders would be defined. It wasn't the glorious conquest Ramses had dreamed of, but it was something potentially more valuable: stability. During one of the negotiation sessions, Ramses found himself face-to-face with Muwatalli at a table laden with maps and treaty drafts. The Hittite king was older than Ramses, seasoned by decades of warfare, his face a roadmap of scars and hard experience. "You know," Muwatalli said during a pause in the formal proceedings, speaking in the diplomatic language they both shared, "my commanders told me you were dead, that we had destroyed your entire division, and then reports came back of an Egyptian king fighting like a demon, charging into our lines without hesitation. They said, you seem to have lost your mind." "Perhaps I had," Ramses replied evenly. "Or perhaps," he said, studying him with an appraising look, "you understood something my commanders did not, that sometimes the act of refusing to accept defeat is itself a kind of victory, that courage, properly displayed, can be as powerful as any army." "You sound like you admire it." "I do." The Hittite king leaned back in his chair. "I have fought many Egyptian pharaohs, young Ramses. Most of them were competent commanders who knew when to advance and when to retreat. They were rational, strategic, predictable. But you," he gestured with one scarred hand, "you did something none of them would have done. You charged into certain death rather than accept the humiliation of retreat. It was foolish. It was tactically insane. And yet it worked, in a way that pure strategy never could have. It almost got me killed. But it didn't. And now here you sit, negotiating from a position of strength despite losing the battle, because my men fear you. They saw something that day that will haunt them for years, an enemy who would not yield, who could not be broken. That is worth more than taking a city." Ramses absorbed this, seeing his actions through the lens of his enemy's perspective. He had been so focused on his own experience of fear and desperation that he hadn't fully considered how it must have looked from the other side. "So, we have a treaty?" "We have a treaty," Muwatalli confirmed. And perhaps, young king, the beginning of something that will serve both our peoples better than endless warfare. Your father and I spent decades trying to destroy each other. I think we can do better." As Ramses left the final negotiation session, holding the treaty documents that would reshape the political landscape of the entire region, he felt something he had not expected to feel. Pride. Not the hollow, performative pride of his earlier reign, but genuine satisfaction at having turned disaster into opportunity. The journey back to Egypt was long and somber. The army that returned was smaller than the one that had marched north, marked by loss and hardship. But there was something in the bearing of the soldiers that spoke to transformation. They had been tested in ways that peacetime armies never are, and they had endured. As the Nile came into view, Ramses stood at the front of the column beside Mena, whose wounded shoulder had healed into a permanent reminder of their shared experience. "Home," Mena said simply. "Home," Ramses agreed. And then, after a pause, "Do you think they'll understand, the people, when we tell them what happened?" "Some will. The veterans, those who have seen combat, they'll understand that sometimes survival is its own kind of victory. The others," he shrugged his good shoulder, "they'll believe whatever the poets tell them to believe. The poets will turn it into myth. They always do. By the time the temple reliefs are carved, I'll be shown as a god-king routing thousands of enemies single-handedly. The truth will be buried under layers of propaganda." "Is that so bad?" Mena asked. "People need myths, need heroes. If you give them the messy, complicated truth, they won't know what to do with it." "Perhaps," Ramses said, "but I'll know the truth. And everyone who was there will know the truth. And maybe that's enough." The royal reception in Thebes was everything Ramses had expected and dreaded. Crowds lined the streets, cheering for their returning pharaoh. Priests chanted hymns of victory. Flower petals rained down from balconies. To see the celebration, you'd think Egypt had won a crushing, decisive triumph. Ramses played his part, waving to the crowds, accepting the adulation with the practiced grace of his station. But inside, he felt the disconnect between image and reality more keenly than ever before. These people were celebrating a myth, while the truth, messy, painful, complicated, remained hidden beneath layers of official narrative. That night, in the privacy of the royal chambers, Nefertari found him staring at a blank papyrus scroll, a reed pen idle in his hand. "What troubles you?" she asked, settling beside him. "I want to write an account, something honest. Not the official propaganda that will be carved into temples, but the real story. What actually happened. How afraid I was. How close we came to total destruction. The mistakes I made. And who would read such an account? No one, probably. That's the point. It would be for me. A way of remembering who I really was in that moment before the poets and sculptors transformed me into something I'm not." Nefertari was quiet for a moment. Then she placed her hand over his, stilling the pen. "Then write it. Write the truth. Keep it somewhere safe. And when the temple walls are covered with images of you as an invincible god-king, you can read your own words and remember the man who actually stood on that battlefield." So Ramses wrote. Through the night and into the early morning hours, he poured out the full story of Kadesh, not the sanitized version that would be presented to the public, but the raw, unvarnished truth. His arrogance, his fear, his desperation, the luck that saved him as much as any skill or divine favor. He wrote about Mena's loyalty, about the soldiers who followed him into that impossible charge, about Nefertari's wisdom in helping him see beyond his own self-recrimination. He wrote about Mu'tali and the negotiations, about learning to see strength in compromise rather than only in conquest. He finished as the sun rose over Thebes, sealed the scroll, and placed it in a cedar box alongside other precious private things. No one but Nefertari would ever read it, but it existed, a counter-narrative to the myth that was already being constructed around him. That, he thought, would have to be enough.
The years that followed were transformative for both Ramses and Egypt. The peace treaty with the Hittites held, bringing unprecedented stability to the region. Trade flourished. Egyptian merchants traveled routes that had been too dangerous for decades. Cultural exchange increased, and Ramses himself changed in ways both subtle and profound. He still commissioned temples and monuments. That was part of his role, part of maintaining the divine image of kingship that Egyptian society required. But there was a difference in how he approached his duties. Less arrogance, more humility, a willingness to listen to advisors, to admit uncertainty, to recognize that being a king meant serving his people rather than simply commanding them. The veterans of Kadesh became a kind of unofficial inner circle, men who had stood with him in that desperate charge, who had seen him at his worst and his best, who understood the difference between the public image and the private reality. They served him with a loyalty that went beyond mere duty, and he in turn valued their counsel above that of courtiers who had never faced genuine hardship. 10 years after Kadesh, a young officer came to seek an audience with the Pharaoh. He was barely 20, eager and bright-eyed, reminding Ramses uncomfortably of himself at that age. "My lord," the young officer said, bowing low, "I have been studying the military campaigns of your reign, and I must know, at Kadesh, when you charged into the Hittite forces, what gave you the courage to do something so bold?" Ramses smiled, and there was something bittersweet in that smile. "You've read the official accounts, I assume, the ones carved into the temple walls." "Yes, my lord. They say you called upon Amun-Ra, and the god filled you with divine strength, allowing you to smite your enemies single-handedly." "And do you believe that?" The young officer hesitated, clearly not wanting to contradict the official narrative. That is what the inscriptions say, my lord." "The inscriptions say many things. They say I am a living god, that I cannot be defeated, that my enemies tremble at the mere mention of my name. And perhaps those things are true in the way that myths are true. They represent ideals, aspirations, the image of kingship that our society requires. But if you want to know what actually happened at Kadesh, what actually gave me the courage to charge, it wasn't divine strength. It was fear. The young officer's confusion was evident. "I was terrified," Ramses continued, "more afraid than I had ever been. And in that fear, I understood that I had two choices. I could run and preserve my life, but lose everything that made that life worth living. Or I could stand, knowing I would probably die, but at least die as the man I wanted to be, rather than the coward I was afraid of becoming." He turned back to face the young officer. "That's what courage is, in the end. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, to choose the hard right over the easy wrong. And yes, we survived, through luck and the arrival of reinforcements and the unpredictable chaos of battle. But the decision to charge, that wasn't divine intervention. That was human choice." The young officer absorbed this, and Ramses could see him grappling with the disconnect between the myth and the reality. "But, my lord," he said finally, "if you tell people that, if you admit you were afraid, that you nearly died through your own mistakes, won't that diminish you in their eyes?" "Perhaps," Ramses agreed. "But I would rather be diminished as a man who tells the truth than elevated as a god who lives a lie. The image on the temple walls will outlast me by thousands of years. That image will show me as invincible, divine, perfect. Let it do. But I know what I actually was that day, a young king who made terrible mistakes and somehow found the strength to face them. That's the legacy I choose to carry, even if no one else ever knows it." The young officer left the audience chamber with much to think about.
and Ramses returned to his duties, feeling the comfortable weight of his responsibilities settling onto his shoulders. He had been pharaoh for 15 years now. He would reign for another 52, becoming one of the longest ruling monarchs in Egyptian history. He would father over 100 children, would commission monuments that would amaze and inspire humans for millennia. His face would become synonymous with ancient Egypt itself. But he would never forget the day at Kadesh when all of that nearly ended, when he stood on the edge of annihilation and chose to be a man rather than a myth, when he learned that true strength came not from pretending to be perfect, but from acknowledging your flaws and finding the courage to transcend them. That was the real victory of Kadesh, not the battle itself, not the treaty that followed, but the transformation it sparked within him. The understanding that kingship was not about being more than human, but about being the best human you could possibly be.
On a winter evening 33 years after Kadesh, an old soldier came to the palace. He was weathered and bent, his face mapped with scars, one arm hanging useless at his side. But his eyes were clear, and when he asked to see the pharaoh, there was something in his bearing that made the guards take notice. They brought him to Ramses, who was now in his 60s, his body bearing the accumulated weight of decades of rule, but his mind still sharp, his eyes still carrying that peculiar intensity that those who had known him at Kadesh would never forget. "Do you remember me, my lord?" the old soldier asked. Ramses studied him. Something familiar in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself despite his injuries. And then it clicked. "You drove the chariot behind mine. In the charge at Kadesh, I remember seeing you break through the first wave. Amenhotep, son of Ptahmes." The old soldier's eyes widened in shock. "You remember my name?" "I remember everyone who charged with me that day. Every face, every name. I made it my business to learn them all after the battle, to never forget the men who followed me into that madness." Tears began streaming down the old soldier's weathered face. "My lord, I've carried something with me all these years, something I needed to say to you but never found the courage, until now when I'm dying and courage seems easier to come by." "Speak," Ramses said. "That day, when you charged, when you refused to run, we all thought you were mad. We thought you were going to get us all killed for nothing, and we were terrified, not just of the Hittites, but of following our king into what we knew was certain death." Ramses said nothing, just listened. "But then you said something. You said we should fight not to live, but to show them what it meant to face Egypt, to make our deaths mean something. And somehow that made the fear manageable. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about dignity, about being men worth remembering." The old soldier's voice wavered. "I've lived 33 more years because of that day. 33 years I'd never expected to have. I married. I had children. I've seen sunsets and tasted wine and felt the Nile wind on my face. And every day of those 33 years, I have remembered that I owe them to a king who taught me that some things matter more than being afraid." He reached into his robes and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Unwrapping it revealed a small bronze blade, notched and corroded with age. "This broke off my sword during the battle. I've kept it all this time. And now, at the end of my life, I wanted to return it to you. Or rather, to return with it, to stand before you one more time and say, 'You were right. What you did that day, what you taught us, it mattered. It still matters.'" Ramses took the broken blade, feeling its weight in his palm. How strange that such a small fragment of metal could carry so much meaning, so much memory. Across the room, Nefertari watched the exchange, tears glistening in her own eyes. She had grown old alongside Ramses,
her beauty now carried in the grace of her movements, the wisdom in her eyes. She had been there for all of it, the triumph and the failure, the growth and the learning. She knew better than anyone what this moment meant to her husband. Amenhotep, son of Ptahmes, Ramses said, his voice thick with emotion. When the priests write my final monuments, when they list my achievements and victories, your name will be among them. Because you stood with me when standing seemed like madness. You charged when wisdom counseled retreat. You showed me that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. He paused, then added, but more than that, thank you for living, for taking those 33 years you didn't expect to have and filling them with life, with marriage and children and sunsets and wine and wind. That's what we fought for in the end. Not for glory, not for conquest, but for the right of our people to live their lives in peace. You honored that by living well. The old soldier bowed deeply, his tears falling freely now. Thank you, my lord. That is more than I ever hoped for. After he left, Ramses sat alone in his chamber, holding the broken blade. Nefertari joined him, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that had become comfortable through decades of partnership. You gave him a great gift, she said softly. He gave me a greater one. He reminded me why it all mattered, why that day at Kadesh, as terrible and frightening as it was also the most important day of my life. He placed the broken blade in the cedar box alongside other precious objects, letters from his children, a lock of Nefertari's hair from when it was still jet black, a scarab beetle his father had given him, and the sealed scroll containing his honest account of Kadesh. Things that mattered not for their material value, but for their connection to moments that had shaped him. Do you ever regret it? Nefertari asked. The way the things turned out, not capturing Kadesh, the treaty, instead of conquest. Ramses was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. No, he said finally. If we had conquered Kadesh that day, if the trap had never happened, I would have continued being the arrogant young king who thought he was invincible. I would have made worse mistakes, started unnecessary wars, ruled from a place of ego rather than wisdom. Kadesh broke me. And in breaking me, it made me into something better. He looked at the objects in the box, each one a fragment of his journey from prideful youth to something approaching wisdom. I've built monuments that will stand for thousands of years. My name will be remembered long after I am dust. But none of that matters as much as the life I've actually lived, the decisions I've made, the man I've tried to become. And who have you become? Nefertari asked, though she already knew the answer. A man, Ramses said simply. Just a man who happened to be king, who made terrible mistakes and somehow learned from them, who discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but to choose to stand, even when fear threatened to overwhelm you. Who learned that true strength came not from pretending to be perfect, but from acknowledging your flaws and doing better. That's who I became. And if I could go back to that dusty battlefield, knowing everything that would come after, the fear, the mistakes, the near death, the humiliation of retreat, I wouldn't change a thing. Because that day made me real in a way I had never been before. Outside, the sun set over Thebes, painting the Nile in shades of amber and gold. In his palace, the Pharaoh Ramses II, who had refused to die as a coward and learned instead to live as something better, smiled. He had been young at Kadesh, foolish, arrogant, terrified. But he had also been brave, And in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the monuments, not the propaganda, not the divine titles and elaborate ceremonies, just the simple, profound courage of standing when everything screamed at you to run. That, he thought, was a legacy worth leaving, not carved in stone or written in papyrus, but lived in the example of a king who chose to be human in his finest moment, who showed that gods might be perfect, but humans, flawed, frightened, uncertain humans, could be brave. And bravery, he had learned, was the greatest divinity of all. The Pharaoh who refused to die had instead discovered how to truly live. And that made all the difference.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.